Good morning, everybody, and good morning to our participants online. My name is Tiago Ottman. I'm going to be the MC of this for discussion. So, questions online, please direct them to the chat, and I'll relay them. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Bougainville people, and acknowledge their leadership, past, present, and future. Today, we are very privileged to have Professor Regan with us to present on the post-referendum process in Bougainville. The referendum was a remarkable event and drew headlines around the world and surprised many onlookers. And a lot of work has gone on into putting that together. The post-referendum process is a little bit less well understood, less well publicized. What was to happen, what has actually happened. That's not as easy to find out. Anthony has been working extremely hard on this and producing, as he has told me just before, a terrifying amount of material. But I'm not going to try to scare you, because I'm sure that we're going to be able to appreciate it in this session. So without further ado, Anthony Regan.
Should mention that we've had the best publicity ever for an ANU Department of Pacific Affairs seminar. This is the story in today's Post-Courier, where the abstract for this seminar has been reprinted as a news story. So we'll have to put it on our measurable outcomes list. The topic I provided for this seminar was the Bougainville post-referendum process, decision 2324, question mark. And in fact, I should have put two question marks. One is whether, in relation to the question of whether there will be a decision by sometime in 24. The other is whether the whole decision-making process that they've embarked on in the last year or so should perhaps be set aside and a different part of the process attempted again. I won't go into detail on that now. We'll come to that. As I said to Sonia on the way over, I'd signaled to her when the provocative bit was coming. The referendum held late in 2019 was very well conducted, very high turnout of 84%, and 97.7% of the voting Bougainvilleans voted for independence, and only 1.7% for the alternative which Papua New Guinea proposed of greater autonomy for Bougainville. That's greater than their current level of autonomy. After the referendum came a constitutionally mandated decision-making process, because the referendum itself, the outcome of the referendum, was not binding on Papua New Guinea. Now, it's quite normal, as Matt Kvorchuk, sitting over here, who's the world's expert on referendums and independence referendums, it's quite normal for independence referendums not to be expressed to be binding in the constitution or the law or the agreement that provides for it. So that's not unusual, but normally there's nothing in the constitution, law or agreement about a mandated post-referendum decision-making process. Rather, as Matt points out, it's generally accepted that the government shouldn't override the will of the people if they've voted strongly for independence. So in a sense, even though they're not expressed to be binding on the national government, they in fact tend to be accepted as binding if there's a vote for independence. Bougainville's an unusual case then in having a non-binding referendum and a mandated post-referendum decision-making process. So it's an interesting case internationally for an unusual way ahead. So let's have a look. As Tioga said, there's been a lot written about the referendum, the planning for the referendum, but remarkably little has been said about the post-referendum process. It's a possibly three-stage process laid down in the Peace Agreement and the PNG constitutional provisions that implemented the Peace Agreement. So this is a constitutionally mandated post-referendum process. It began, in a sense, in mid-2018, 18 months before the referendum, when people from both national government and the Bougainville government and from the international community were a bit worried about how the referendum might be received, how the post-referendum decision-making process might work. They were worried that there could be misunderstandings and possibly differences and even conflict. And so they proposed, it was proposed in the joint supervisory body, it's the joint PNG Bougainville Government body that oversees implementation of the peace agreement. It was proposed by the Bougainville government that a post-referendum planning task force be established. And that began work in 2019 and worked pretty much for the whole of the year. It was a relatively high-powered body chaired by the National Minister for Bougainville Affairs, jointly with the Bougainville Minister responsible for the peace agreement implementation and the referendum. It met 8 times in 2019 at meetings attended by, at times, the Deputy Prime Minister of PNG, the Bougainville President and Vice President, many ministers, many senior officers. And over that period, it came up with a quite detailed program for conduct of the post-referendum process. And part of the reason why that was needed was that the peace agreement and the constitution were very short on detail for the post-referendum process. There'd been quite a bit of detail on the referendum in the organic law that supports the implementation of the PNG Constitution. There was actually a whole law in the schedule for the conduct of the referendum. So a lot of attention had been given to how to implement the main parts of the peace agreement, but very little was there on the post-referendum process, other than it was possibly 3-stage. The first stage was consultation between the two governments. Nothing was said about the timetable for the commencement of that process. Nothing was said about how long it should take to complete, how it should be run. Second stage was a decision by Parliament. And while the peace agreement said that the decision by Parliament was on the basis that Parliament had final decision-making authority on the results, those words about final decision-making power for the Parliament were omitted from the section of the Constitution that implemented the clause of the peace agreement that said final decision-making power. It simply said in the Constitution, the results will be tabled in the Parliament and any decision the Parliament makes will go to the two cabinets. So very little there about when it should be, how it should be. The third, and this is only a possible stage in a post-decision-making process, is a dispute resolution process. The peace agreement and the Constitution provide an intergovernment dispute resolution process, which applies to any kind of dispute that arises between the two governments, national government and Bougainville government. And that decision-making process has 3 possible stages. So we have a 3-stage process on decision making and a 3-stage dispute resolution process at the end, if there's any disputes about the referendum. That's important because even if Parliament has final decision-making authority, and that's unclear, that decision of the Parliament can almost certainly be questioned through the dispute resolution process, which includes the possible reference of to the Supreme Court of constitutional issues. So you get an idea of a fairly complicated process with a very unclear timeline and pretty uncertain outcomes. So what's happened so far? Well, the first stage of the process began 18 months after the referendum. The task force that had worked in 2019 had proposed that the post-referendum consultation process, first stage in the 3-stage decision-making process, that it should begin as soon as possible after the referendum. And on the day after the referendum results were announced, the PNG Prime Minister said he believed it would begin very early in 2020. It didn't. It began 18 months later. And there's a whole series of reasons for that, including problems in the Bougainville government. The Bougainville government wanted to change the Bougainville Constitution to give President John Momis, who was just finishing 2 terms, a 3rd term. And that would involve amending the Constitution to give him the 3rd term. That went to the Bougainville Parliament in early 2020 and was defeated. And so the Bougainville government took the matter to the Supreme Court, claiming that the Bougainville Constitution breached the human rights provisions of the National Constitution. So the Bougainville government was very focused on these processes to get Momis a 3rd term because they argued it needed continuity in leadership in the consultation process. So they proposed to the national government to delay the consultation process beginning until after the Supreme Court had made its decision. The Supreme Court made its decision in late May 2020 and rejected the Bougainville argument. So there'd been a delay of starting the consultation process until after the Bougainville election that was due in mid-2020. It turned out that the reason for delay was not there. Momis was not going to get his 3rd term. And at the same time, COVID. And so it ended up that the Bougainville election was held much later than expected in September 2020, and a new president elected, Ismail Torama, in late 2020. He took office on the 29th of September 2020. So by this stage, almost a year had gone since the referendum. Torama then sought to get the process underway as quickly as possible. And Marape, the Prime Minister, who was Minister for Bougainville Affairs, agreed. And they were all set to hold a meeting, first consultation meeting at the end of November 2020, when, as sometimes happens in PNG, a political and constitutional crisis developed very suddenly, and it looked like there was going to be a vote of no confidence and that Marape was going to lose his position. So again, or not again, for the first time, the consultation process was actually, when a date had been set, was stopped. And there was then a series of attempts to get a first meeting, including a proposal for a first meeting in early March of 2021. And that was put off because of the death of Sir Michael Somare and the mass national mourning that took place over the next month after he died in late February, combined with a whole lot of bans on travel and public meetings due to COVID. So as a result of all of this, by April, there was no discussion of when this first meeting should begin. In Bougainville, there started to be some discussion of the possibility of UDI, because PNG wasn't serious about the post-referendum discussion. And so the UN became extremely exercised, and the UN resident coordinator upped his diplomacy, one might say. And as a result of that pressure and pressure from the Bougainville government's statements and concerns being expressed by Taurama Tumarape, at very short notice, agreement was reached to hold the first meeting on the 18th and 19th of May in Kokopo. As a result, the national government was getting ready for the first consultation meeting at very short notice. It was making decisions about how it would proceed, who would represent it, in mid-May, days before the first meeting. And in large part as a result of this way in which the agreement on holding the meeting was reached, all that the task force had worked on back in 2019 was set aside and forgotten. Now, what did the task force propose? Did it propose ground rules? Did it propose confidentiality rules? It had proposed a lot of stuff about support to the process, including the appointment of an independent external moderator who would chair the meetings in the consultation, would help the parties, advise them as required, and help resolve differences. A moderator was appointed jointly by Morape and Taurama, at least by announcement, in early November. It was to be Bertie Ahern, who chaired the Bougainville Referendum Commission, former Irish Prime Minister. However, because things were being thrown together so quickly in May of 2021, 18 months after the referendum, there was no time to get Bertie Ahern involved. And in the end, he never came to any of the meetings, although he did virtually participate in one of the meetings. But he never played that advisory dispute resolution role. And I would say that that's proved very significant. There's not been the assistance to the parties to find creative ways of going ahead. And we'll come back to that. In addition, the task force had proposed an independent secretariat to prepare, organise, maintain records, and so on. Nothing was done about that. It's never been established. So instead, what happened in 2021, in May, when they were getting ready for their first meeting in Kokopo in East New Britain, the two governments reverted to what they were used to, how they run their joint supervisory body meetings, which meet once or twice a year, chaired jointly by the Prime Minister and the President. And so they have a technical officers meeting before each joint supervisory body meeting. The real work tends to be done there. The documentation for the consideration of the leaders is prepared. Things often get changed dramatically by what the leaders decide, but the basic negotiation around the issues happens at an officers level and then gets presented up. That was really the only agreement on how to run the process. So they held 3 meetings in 2021. The first one, as I said, in May, 18th and 19th of May. The second one in Wabag in the Highlands, in Enga, early in July, and the third one in December. At the first meeting, the Bougainville government put forward its position. Its position was the people have voted overwhelmingly for independence, almost unanimously. 1.7% for the alternative. So all the alternatives that might be offered was the subtext. All the alternatives you offer, if we think that they're just greater autonomy, which the people have rejected, we're not going to take it on board. Now, of course, that meant that the Bougainvilleans were counting out some quite significant possibilities. Free association on the New Zealand model with new equal violence. They regard it as greater autonomy because it wouldn't give Bougainville membership of the United Nations. So that did rather constrain things. So the Bougainville government put forward their proposal, full sovereignty by 2025 and membership of the UN as a result of PNG accepting and recognising Bougainville's independence. It's very difficult to get membership of the UN if the parent state of a seceding entity doesn't support it. So Bougainville's been focused on getting PNG agreement. That proposal went on the table. It was not rejected by PNG, and Marape, jointly chairing the meeting, said that the national government recognised, wasn't challenging the decision, said that the vote was as high as Mount Wilhelm, the highest mountain in Papua New Guinea, and must be respected. They didn't oppose it, and they didn't put an alternative. They did express reservations. Marape expressed reservations. One, that the president might lead other parts of Papua New Guinea that were resource rich, try and secede, and might lead to the eventual dissolution of PNG. He talked about the risks of division of families and communities coming from secession, and he raised the query of whether Bougainville was ready financially, revenue-wise, and capacity-wise for independence. After that, the Bougainville side felt they were pretty close. PNG wasn't saying no, it was saying it recognised the results, so we're nearly there. Then in July of 2021, in the JTT, the Joint Technical Team meeting, remember I was saying how the officers would meet before a meeting, and what they decided would go to the leaders meeting. In the Joint Technical Team meeting, the national government took a timeline that Bougainville had tabled in the first meeting, which indicated a number of steps, including adoption of a Bougainville Constitution, a number of steps that would lead to independence, and the final step was a declaration of independence. The national government hadn't commented on that timeline tabled at the very end of the meeting, but it presented a version of it to the Joint Technical Team meeting in the lead up to the second meeting. And they dropped all the things which assumed independence, but put in other possible steps, changed the final date from 2025 to 2030, and the final step was Bougainville Declaration of Independence. So the Bougainville side was jubilant. They're conceding. We were nearly there last time. Yeah, they weren't opposing. Now they've agreed. And they were jubilant. The officers reported back to the leaders as their meetings went on. The meetings went on and on for a week amongst the officers. They reported back that leaders were jubilant, coming to Wabag. Towards the end of the week, the national government officers realised their problem and were saying, look, that wasn't conceding independence. Bougainville said, oh, don't worry. They insisted on putting back into the timeline some of the things which presumed a final outcome of independence, including adopting a Bougainville Independence Constitution. And for unclear reasons, PNG officers agreed to that. So the document that went to the Wabag leaders meeting had a final step of a declaration of independence. And steps towards its independence were reinserted. There was confused debate. The second meeting was short, less than a day. The first meeting had happened over 2 days. This meeting was short, as is normally the case with the JSB, the Joint Supervisory Body, because the real work's done in the officers' meeting. The leaders are signing off, making changes, sometimes substantial, but they're working from a set document. So here was the draft document, including a timeline, And debate went on back and forth. And it was only quite late in the meeting that Marape insisted that the final step of the timeline to be attached to a statement from the meeting, that the final step would be Bougainville Declaration of Independence / political settlement. PNG was saying it can be either what you want, a declaration of independence, or some other form of political settlement, which is what we would be wanting. But Bougainville said, well, the only kind of political settlement is independence, obviously. So they went away very happy. And in the Post-Courier the next day, the 7th of July 2021, the headline was independence agreed. Marape had to put out statements immediately that day saying that was not the case. They hadn't agreed. They hadn't conceded anything. It was all going to take a long time. And in a subsequent series of statements made over the next few months, hammered that point. So the third meeting, when it was held in December of 2021, a very frustrated Bougainville side, very deflated, thought they were nearly there and now they were years away, said that the process, the consultation process is now over, and let's deal with the real issue, independence, and how we're going to get the thing to Parliament. Bougainville's position on what the role of Parliament was that Parliament had to agree, had to endorse whatever was agreed between the governments. That was their take on the omission of the words about final decision-making authority of Parliament from the Constitution. Their take was, because of particular wording, which I won't go into, it's a technical legal argument, their view was that the role of the Parliament was limited to endorsing what was agreed between the governments during the consultation process. However, it seems that they didn't quite focus on the point that if they were now going to Parliament, having ended the consultation process, in the absence of an agreed position, there was nothing for Parliament to endorse. And that problem has never been ironed out. I think what happened was that the Bougainville side was so frustrated, they were just signalling their frustration. We've got 97.7%, you can't override the will of the people, as Matthew Portrait would say. This was an independence referendum with a high vote. You shouldn't be overriding the will of the people. You should be agreeing. Come on, let's go, let's agree. And they hadn't really thought through the consequence of not following through their interpretation of what the role of Parliament was. Because of course now they were agreeing to go to Parliament with the national government. With the national government saying that it was up to Parliament to decide what it wanted. So naturally enough, over the next 18 months, this is between December 2021 and now, it's been extremely difficult to get agreement on how you go to Parliament and what the role of Parliament is. And because, I won't go into the detail, there's been a covenant signed about how to do this, there's been debates about how to give effect to the covenant, there's been proposals about constitutional regulations to provide for the role of Parliament. It's back and forth, has got nowhere. And so in June, on the 13th of June, the Minister for Bougainville Affairs, who'd taken over from Marape had been Minister for Bougainville Affairs until the election in PNG in 2022. He handed over to a young lawyer from Kela province, Manese Makiba. And on the 13th of June, he made a significant presentation to Parliament, a presentation that had been approved by the Cabinet and so clearly represents PNG policy. He proposed a number of things. He said, first of all, the officers on both sides have not been able to agree the power or the role of Parliament or how things go to Parliament. We've got no constitution or regulation. So I'm proposing that I table the results of the referendum in Parliament before the end of 2023, and that Parliament adopt a sessional order determining how it deals with the question of the results and what happens to them. A sessional order is the equivalent of a standing order. Standing orders are literally standing. They're the orders of the Parliament about how it runs its business, which operate continually. If there's a gap in the standing orders or lack of sufficient provision in the standing orders for anything in particular, under the standing orders, the Parliament can adopt a sessional order, an order that applies to just the particular session to deal with the gap or the lack of provision, insufficient provision. So he proposed Parliament adopt a sessional order, and he gave the outline of that order. It would allow Parliament to deal with a motion to accept the results. It would not be able to be debated, the motion would not be able to be debated until 3 sessions of the Parliament had elapsed. And that was to allow a bipartisan parliamentary committee to mount an awareness and a consultation program across the country so that the people of the country could express their views on possible Bougainville secession, and that could inform the MPs. And it would also involve improving the awareness of the MPs, who are the people who are going to vote. Finally, when the motion could be voted on, it would require a 2/3 absolute majority vote to be approved. Bougainville clerk of the Bougainville Parliament and the clerk of the PNG Parliament had met a couple of months before and come up with a draft sessional order, and theirs envisaged a simple majority. Now, the difference between a simple majority and a 2/3 majority is important to understand. A simple majority is a majority of the members present and voting. So if you've got lots of members not present, which is often the case, or members who are abstaining, they're not counted. And so a simple majority can be much less than half. If the quorum is half, for example, you need half of the members present and voting. So a number abstain, you can get down to 15 or 20 passing something out of a membership of 118. 2/3 absolute majority is 2/3 of all the seats, whether or not they're there, and whether or not they're voting. You've still got to have at least 2/3. So this was a dramatic increase on what had been discussed. And as the Bougainville leadership pointed out, there'd been no consultation between them, between the ABG and the national government on this massive majority. The Bougainville Attorney General, and he's got one of the longest ministerial names in the world, he's the Attorney General and the Minister for Implementation of Bougainville's Independence Mission. His name is Ezekiel Massa. He's been taking on the challenge. He's objected to the 2/3 absolute majority on the grounds, not that what the clerks of Parliament agreed was valid, but on the grounds that there'd been no consultation. And he said that given most members of Parliament elected last year had never dealt with Bougainville issues, it was meaning that the Bougainville possibility was, the possibility of independence was gone. And he said the national government is now hell-bent on preventing Bougainville becoming independent. So what's now likely to happen? Well, McKendall's saying, the Minister, he'll table the results before the end of 2021 and have the sessional order adopted before then. At that stage, there'll have to be at least 3 sessions of Parliament missed while the bipartisan committee works. So far, nothing's been done to establish the bipartisan committee. There's no indication whether even the funding is available. So it seems very unlikely that if all of this happened, that it could happen before perhaps middle of next year. So the earliest we would be having a decision of the Parliament would be in the middle of 2024. But now I'm going to be provocative. My suggestion is that because of the very limited detail there was about the post-referendum decision-making process, because the quite sensible proposals for conduct and support of the process were never adopted, because of the long delay in getting the process underway, it didn't start until May of 2021, and because of the use of the JSB, Joint Supervisory Body procedures, which see very little engagement between the decision makers. The decision makers are just dealing with documents that come from the technical officers. There's never been a serious engagement in the consultation process. So my suggestion to both sides is that it would be a mistake to go to Parliament in these circumstances where it would be a matter of Parliament having a yes or no vote. It's not clear what would even happen after a yes or no vote. Back in 2021, Marape in the main meeting, the first consultation meeting, said that if Parliament were to vote no, because he was saying it's up to Parliament in the end, even though Bougainville wasn't really agreeing that, this was his view. He's saying if it was a no vote, the government was looking at options for then ceasing the process and resuming consultation. But Makiba made no mention of that possibility. So at the moment, all that's in the offering is a yes or no vote. What would Bougainville do if there was a no vote? Clearly, there'd be great pressure. I'm not saying this would necessarily happen, but there'd be great pressure for a UDI, a unilateral declaration of independence. It would be very difficult for Bougainville to manage a UDI. It's only generating about 15 to 20% of its annual budget. Its public service capacity to even manage its current powers and responsibilities is limited. And it would have to take on a hell of a lot more if it was to mount a UDI and try and become truly independent. If a UDI were mounted and PNG cut off its funding, it would be very difficult for Bougainville to manage. And you can imagine real internal pressures in Bougainville that could lead to the kinds of divisions and conflicts that have happened in the past. So there's very good reason not to rush down that path. So my suggestion is that we should look at returning to consultation and conduct the consultation in a different way, not as the JSB, Joint Supervisory Body meetings run, but in a way that encourages the two sides to listen to one another, hear one another's concerns, try and work creatively to find an option that would work for them, that takes account of Bougainville's view that the vast majority of their people having voted for independence, that the will of the people should not be overridden, and taking account of the concerns PNG has, which include, genuinely, I think, concern about whether there will be the capacity in Bougainville at the moment to run independence. There would also be a lot of advantage in, as soon as possible, getting an independent and experienced moderator involved. Somebody who could chair meetings over extended periods, not these short meetings, offer advice to the parties, and help in resolving differences, as the task force proposed back in 2019, and as has so far failed to happen. There is real discussion going on at the moment between Bougainville and the national government about appointing a moderator of some substance. To me, that signals that perhaps what I'm asking the sides to consider is not as provocative as it might be. If they're heading towards getting a moderator back involved, that suggests an openness now to going back to trying to resolve the differences between them. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with a process that's in a very uncertain situation, in a sort of precarious balance. It's a situation where the international community, apart from the UN, is almost completely hands-off. The UN's very involved and has played creative roles, and although the rest of the international community is not directly involved much, it is the international community that's funding the work the UN is doing. Australia and New Zealand and other countries are putting the money in, but certainly not making any big public statements about it. The international community, although the original peace process was, the international community's role was a light touch one. I wrote a book about it called Light Intervention. So it wasn't an overwhelming role, but it was offering support in all sorts of creative ways, including running major meetings of the party over extended periods in both New Zealand and Australia. The New Zealand meetings are well known, 2 at Burnham Barracks, 1 at Lincoln University, and 1 at a place called Matakana. But there were also meetings, a number of significant meetings in Australia, including a very big meeting of about 150 ex-combatants in February of 2001 in Townsville at the Air Force base there to try and sort out the weapons disposal aspect of the peace agreement. Could the international community step in and offer out-of-country extended meetings? Are there other things that the international community could do? Could they jointly, pool their efforts to find the best possible moderator? We ought to be, I think, thinking about the international community encouraging the two sides to set up a different kind of process, a process where they do engage creatively. They're still engaging reasonably amicably, but the more things head down the path they're heading towards at the moment, the less amicable they are. Everybody in Papua New Guinea, Bougainville, neighbours, Solomon Islands, Australia, New Zealand, the region, have an interest in making sure that this does not deteriorate into bad relationships. I don't think there's a risk of resumption of violent conflict. There's no appetite for that in either the Bougainville or Papua New Guinea leadership, or in those that were the institutions that were involved in the conflict, the PNGDF and the BRA and so on. But depending on how this played out, I think it's far from impossible to think about serious internal conflict in Bougainville. In addition, if Bougainville would amount a UDI under pressure, frustrated, other problems could occur. There'd be great pressure to reopen the Panguna mine as quickly as possible. And that would be a recipe for bad decision-making about the mine. Bad decision-making back in the 60s and 70s led to war in Bougainville in 1988. We need to ensure that decisions about whether the mine reopens, and if it does, how it reopens, are made in measured and considered ways, not under immediate pressure. So these are just some of the risks that are involved in the situation if we don't find a better way of ensuring a sensible decision is made about what's always been the big issue in this process, the future political status of Bougainville. Thanks.